It's now time to turn back the page and return to our original role as external auditors. So, we are still in the exciting world of internal controls, but this time we're going to view it from the point of view of the external auditor. What is the auditor's consideration of internal controls? Well, you might remember our audit risk model. We presented this one even as early as the first installment of our lecture series. We said we have to set the desired level or the acceptable level of audit risk, and then we need to assess inherent risk, to assess control risk, and eventually determine what is our acceptable level of detection risk, which will drive the nature, timing, and extent of our substantive testing. Now, setting the desired level of audit risk as well as assessing the inherent risk, we have discussed this when we talked about audit planning in the previous installment videos that we had. Now we're going to focus our attention on assessing control risk. This is where we are right now. So technically, the assessment of control risk is also part of audit planning, but we're giving it the highlight. We're making it the star of our show. We're making it the centerpiece, the main attraction. That is why we're going to discuss it separately in this lecture series. And then, of course, after we have done that, we're going to talk about performing substantive tests, which will happen in the next lecture series that we will be having. So, in terms of consideration of internal controls, well, for each financial statement assertion, let's stop a bit and let's ask ourselves, wait, do I still remember what are the FS assertions? Well, I remember that there are two categories, one relating to transactions and the other one relating to balances. This is now the perfect time for you to do a mental inventory of the FS assertions. Okay, so fast forward to now. So for each FS assertion, obtain an understanding of relevant internal controls sufficient to plan the audit. Please take note that we are required to obtain this understanding. Do you know what else we are required to do? We are required to document the understanding. So, first we obtain the understanding and then we document the understanding. Speaking of documenting the understanding, I sure do hope you have a piece of paper and pen with you because that would be a good way for you to document your understanding of what we're discussing right now. Anyway, back to internal controls. Now, when you document the understanding, of course, the auditor must come to the decision of answering the question, does design and implementation indicate possible reliance? When we obtain the understanding, we look at the design and the implementation of the control. Does the design indicate possible reliance? If the auditor's answer is no, the design is faulty, okay, by the very design, it doesn't seem to be something we can rely on, or the design is there but it wasn't implemented, so the auditor's answer is no, the auditor will immediately assess control risk at the maximum and perform extensive substantive testing. At this point, the auditor's preliminary assessment of control risk also becomes his or her final assessment of the control risk. Why? Because the auditor will no longer need to perform tests of controls because there's no intention to rely and will automatically assess control risk at maximum and perform extensive substantive testing, mainly because controls are not reliable. However, if the auditor, upon looking at the design and implementation, sees that this is something that I may be able to rely on and intends to rely on the controls, then the auditor will ask, will testing be cost effective? Meaning to say, if I perform tests of controls, how likely is it that I would be able to gather sufficient and appropriate evidence that will allow me to reduce my substantive testing later? Will testing be cost effective? If the answer is no, then the auditor will assess control risk at the maximum and will perform extensive substantive testing. However, if the auditor evaluates that the testing will be cost effective, then the auditor will perform test of controls. Upon performance of the test of controls, the auditor will of course gather sufficient and appropriate evidence in order to support his or her preliminary assessment of control risk. After the test of controls are performed, the auditor will then ask, do the results of the test of control support the preliminary assessment? And in this case, because we're in the yes category, we're in the yes column, that means the preliminary assessment must have been that control risk is below maximum, right? That's the preliminary assessment. That's the reason why you are performing test of controls, because you have initially, preliminarily set control risk at less than maximum. So, do the results of the test of control support that control risk is below maximum? If the answer is no, then the auditor will make a final assessment that control risk is at the maximum and will still perform extensive substantive testing. However, if the test of controls would show that yes, indeed, the controls are reliable, they are operating effectively, then the auditor will make the final assessment of control risk as below maximum and will reduce substantive testing. So let's take a look at these stages of the study and evaluation of internal control, which we have presented via a flowchart illustration. But just to, put some more flesh into that discussion, well, we all know that we start by obtaining an understanding of the entity's internal control structure. To do this, we need to perform risk assessment procedures as per PSA ISA 315. And we also know that risk assessment procedures will involve inquiry, inspection, observation, in the particular case of internal controls, when the auditor determines if it is implemented, because remember, under risk assessment, it's implementation and design, or design and implementation. To determine implementation, the auditor will also perform what we call a walkthrough test. So, inquiry, inspection, observation, and a walkthrough test. After that, the auditor will assess the preliminary, meaning the initial level of control risk. Should the auditor put the preliminary level of control risk to be less than maximum, what did we say a while back? Well, the auditor will have to obtain evidence. And to obtain evidence, the auditor will have to perform tests of controls. So after tests of controls have been performed, if they have been performed, then you evaluate the results before the auditor comes up with a final assessment of control risk, which is now used to determine, together with inherent risk, to determine the necessary level of detection risk. Now, remember again that we are required to obtain an understanding, and we are required to understand the five components of internal controls. That is why we presented it a while back when we talked about internal controls from the viewpoint of management. So, we're required to understand the five components, and we are also required to document the understanding. What we are not required to do, however, is to stick to a particular documentation format. What am I saying here? I'm saying that we are required to document, but we're given the freedom to choose whichever documentation form we would like to use. Say, for example, would you rather use an internal accounting control questionnaire? Well, in the form of a questionnaire whereby every time you answer no, it would indicate or signal a weakness in the control. Or maybe you want to use an internal control checklist. It's a list of all of the things that would, well, technically lead to a strong internal control system. And so every time you can't find it and you have not checked it in the checklist, then that means it's a weakness in the system. Or are you fond of using flowcharts, which is what we have presented a while back? It's essentially a graphical representation of your understanding of internal controls. Or for controls which are a bit too complex to be presented in a flowchart, with steps and activities that are too circuitous to be properly reflected in a flowchart, well, you might want to go for narrative descriptions or decision tables. Decision tables are kind of like, if you can imagine with me, say, for example, if event A happens with activity B, how will the internal control system react? So, say, for example, when there is a credit customer, that's event a credit customer who places an order. Activity B, for example, is that the credit limit is breached. So if you have a credit customer who placed an order, but the amount has breached the credit limit, what will the system do? So it's kind of like it presents a combination of events and activities and how the system will react to it. So, say for example, you encoded purely letters on a numeric field. So, purely letters, numeric field, how will the system react? So those are, well, just a very simple appreciation of decision tables. Now, obtaining an understanding, we already know this one. We talked about risk assessment procedures exhaustively in the previous video. So we said inquire, inspect, observe, the big three. We evaluate the design of the control that way, but we want to determine whether it has been implemented. We perform what is called a walkthrough test. Now, a walkthrough test has also a lot of other colorful names attached to it, such as following the audit trail, the cradle to grave test, because you get to see from the start till the end, okay, from the initiating document all the way to the time when it is recorded by an accounting entry and goes into the financial statements, or it can also be called a sample of one test. Now, the auditor uses the understanding of internal control to, of course, identify types of potential misstatements that may occur. We are saying potential misstatements. Just because there is a deficiency in the control or there's a deviation to the control does not automatically mean that a misstatement exists. For example, have you ever tried walking to the office or entering school without your ID on and still being able to enter the campus? Well, technically, that's a deviation, but that doesn't mean that you are not an enrolled student, right? So deviations may occur, but they do not necessarily mean that they are already misstatements. Therefore, our understanding of internal controls will only lead us to identify types of potential misstatements that may occur. Okay, another use of our understanding for internal controls is to consider factors that affect the risk of material misstatement, precisely because the risk of material misstatement is the marriage of inherent risk and control risk. So our understanding completes our understanding as well and assessment of the risk of material misstatement. And finally, we know that the risk of material misstatement bears or has an inverse relationship with our acceptable level of detection risk, and that the acceptable level of detection risk will allow us to design the nature, timing, and extent of our audit procedures. Step two, we'll talk about assessing the preliminary level of control risk. And we know this one already. When the assessed level of control risk is high or maximum, that means there's no intention to rely on the controls. You don't need to perform tests of controls. You can just automatically equate your preliminary assessment to the final assessment and perform extensive substantive testing. However, if it is more efficient to rely on the controls, thus you have assessed it at less than high, or sometimes you call this one low, or sometimes you call this one below maximum. Then we already know that you should first identify the specific internal controls that are likely to prevent or detect and correct material misstatements relevant to the FS assertions, and then to perform test of controls. Take note again that you first have to identify what specific internal controls there are that you intend to rely. And then once you have identified those specific controls, then you test those controls. As a summary, therefore, just to present it in table form. So if you intend to rely on the controls, we call this one the reliance approach, because we want to rely on the controls. If you are using the reliance approach, then that must mean that your control risk assessment is low. If your control risk assessment is low or below maximum or less than high, then that means controls are reliable, and therefore you could have a higher acceptable level of detection risk. The higher the acceptable level of detection risk is, the more chill you are. And so, therefore, the lesser substantive tests you will be performing. However, if you don't intend to rely on the controls because, well, the design is just not giving, so if you don't intend to rely on the controls, we use what is called a no reliance approach. Under a no reliance approach, control risk is assessed at the maximum or high, and detection risk or acceptable detection risk is at a low level. That means in this case, the auditor is strict, and the auditor has every right to be strict because the controls are not reliable. And a strict auditor will definitely do more testing. So there will be more substantive tests. Now, we said that we are required to obtain the understanding, we are required to document the understanding. So, what are the documentation requirements for internal controls in relation to the different control risk assessments that he or she may make? So, if the assessed level of control risk is at the maximum, again, we recall if control risk is at the maximum, we don't intend to rely on the controls. Are we required to document our understanding? Yes, it's a requirement. Do we document the assessed level of control risk? Yes. We say that we have assessed control risk at the maximum. Do we document the basis for control risk assessment? If control risk is assessed at the maximum, you do not need to document the basis for the control risk assessment. Why? Well, the basis would have been test of controls. But since you have assessed it at maximum, then that means you did not perform test of controls. So there is nothing to document. There is no test, no evidence that was gathered to provide the basis for the control risk assessment because you did not perform TOC. But Miss, how about the inquiry, inspection, observation, the walkthrough? Would that not be documented? Yes, it would be documented, but it would be part of the first question, document understanding of internal controls, not the basis for the control risk assessment per se, because you did not perform TOC. But if you assess control risk at below maximum, you have to document the understanding, and this is where risk assessment procedures come in. You have to document what is your assessed level. You simply say we have assessed control risk at below maximum, and then you document the basis, which will now be the results of your test of controls. Okay, step three, you obtain evidential matter to support the assessed level of control risk, like what we have said. Tests of controls are audit procedures designed to evaluate the operating effectiveness. Whereas risk assessment procedures, in terms of control consideration, looks at design and implementation. Tests of controls looks at operating effectiveness of the controls in preventing or detecting. So preventive controls, detective controls, and correcting material misstatements at the assertion level. Because when you talk about controls, well, this has to be at the assertion. When you talk about test of controls, it has to be at the assertion level. And the procedures for test of controls still involve the big three: inquire, inspect, observe. They're always there: inquire, inspect, observe. But this time with the inclusion of reperformance. To reperform means to perform again, to perform again the control. Okay, so that the auditor, it means that the auditor performs the controls. Okay, so reperforms the controls. Step four will, of course, be evaluating the results of evidential matter. If tests of controls are performed, you have to evaluate the results and come up with a final control risk assessment, and then determine the necessary level of detection risk. We are once again reminded of the inverse relationship between detection risk and the risk of material misstatement. We said that the acceptable level of detection risk essentially drives our decision for nature, time, and extent. So here's a summary of how that's happening. If the acceptable detection risk is low, remember that the auditor is very strict. Okay, and because of that, the auditor will make use of more persuasive tests, will test at balance sheet data or as close to balance sheet data as possible, and will use a bigger sample size. If acceptable detection risk is high, mean to say the auditor is at chill mode, and so therefore will use less persuasive tests, may test at interim, and may test less or smaller sample size. Right, so those are the steps in the auditor's consideration of internal controls. We're now ready to talk about what if in your consideration of internal controls, in your obtaining understanding of internal controls, you chanced upon some deficiencies in internal controls. What must the auditor do? Or what is the auditor's responsibilities with regards deficiencies in internal controls? For this, we go to PSA or ISA 265, which defines an internal control deficiency as existing when either a control is designed, implemented, or operated in such a way that it is unable to prevent or detect and correct misstatements in the financial statements on a timely basis, meaning to say it was designed poorly. Okay, the design is not able to meet its objective. And the objective was for it to prevent or detect or correct misstatements. There was a design, there was a control that was designed, so it's present, but it's designed poorly. It's present, but it's not performing. The other definition of internal control deficiency is when there is a control necessary to prevent or detect or correct misstatements on a timely basis. The control is missing. So either the control is present but poorly designed, or the control is totally missing. Either way, both is still considered as an internal control deficiency. So looking at ISA 265 as well, we get to define what is a significant deficiency. And in a few seconds from now, you'll get to realize why it's significant for us to know what's a significant deficiency. But significant deficiency refers to a deficiency or a combination of deficiencies in internal control that, in your professional judgment, is of sufficient importance to merit the attention of those charged with governance. In other words, it's a significant deficiency if you believe that this is something that TCWG or those charged with governance should know. Speaking of which, what then is the auditor's reporting responsibility when it comes to internal control deficiencies? According to ISA 265, the auditor shall communicate in writing significant deficiencies in internal controls identified during the audit to those charged with governance on a timely basis. Two things: the communication must be done in writing, and it is limited to significant deficiencies. Therefore, we will not be reporting to those charged with governance all of the control deficiencies we have seen. We are to report only those which we consider to be significant deficiencies and material weaknesses. We also take note that the required communication is in writing. Yes, that is correct. It must be in writing. But this will not preclude the auditor, this will not stop the auditor from making preliminary oral communications with management, especially if the deficiencies needed to be communicated in a very timely manner, needed to be communicated then and there. Okay, so if time is of the essence, the auditor may initiate, okay, or may start with a verbal communication, but will eventually have to put these in writing. So the requirement is in writing, but the auditor is not precluded from having verbal communication with the management, especially if time is of the essence. Now, this written communication shall include a description of the deficiencies and an explanation of their potential effects, as well as sufficient information to enable those charged with governance and management to understand the context of the communication. So it's important that we do not only give a description of the deficiencies, but that we must let management know what is the context of the communication, so as not to confuse management with regards our responsibilities. We get to remember that when we talk about this context, when we perform an external FS audit, we give an opinion on the financial statements. We do not give an opinion on the internal controls. We only consider the internal controls because it's part of our requirement in performing an external FS audit. But, ladies and gentlemen, we do not give an opinion on internal controls. So, when we report to management the deficiencies that we have chanced upon when we obtain an understanding of internal controls, management must understand that it is not an opinion. We are not giving an opinion on the internal controls. We are simply letting them know of the deficiencies, significant deficiencies that we have found. Secondly, we must make management aware that the audit included consideration of internal controls relevant to the preparation of the FS. Remember the three objectives of management: operations, compliance, financial reporting. While all three objectives are important, and yes, we do get to understand internal controls from the context as external auditors, we get to understand internal controls from the viewpoint of those three objectives, but to the external FS auditor, the most important objective, quite understandably, will be financial statement reporting. And so, therefore, our audit includes consideration of internal controls relevant to the preparation of the FS, but we are not auditing internal controls. The deficiencies that we have seen is not a product of the audit. It's a product of our consideration of internal controls. We also need to let management understand that the matters being reported are limited to those deficiencies that we have identified during the audit and that we have concluded are of sufficient importance to merit being reported to those charged with governance. In other words, we are not reporting all deficiencies And the gauge by which we have decided to report this to management is still our professional judgment. We have limited our communication to them to those deficiencies that we have found that we believe, based on our professional judgment, need to be reported to those charged with governance. Again, management has to understand this clearly so as to avoid any confusion with regards our reporting responsibilities. So if we're going to basically craft a summary of deficiencies, well, we got to say deficiencies might either result from a poorly designed internal control system or a poorly designed, yeah, internal control system, or missing, okay, missing design, meaning to say the controls are not there, either poorly designed controls or missing controls. And in the context of deficiencies that must be reported to management, we apply our professional judgment, but at the onset, we are required to report in writing, okay, significant deficiencies, and do not forget material weaknesses as well. And while we are required to report in writing, we may also verbally communicate with management, especially if time is of the essence. And when we do communicate in writing, we need to make sure that we do not only describe the deficiencies, but we also make management understand the context of our communication. And whoa, we have just finished internal controls. Congratulations, everyone. Good job. I hope you enjoyed our conversation on internal control. Our next lecture series, the next installment, will finally talk about the details of risk response after having assessing inherent risk and control risk. We then decide on what is the acceptable level of detection risk and get to talk about substantive testing. But all of those in the next video. I hope that you now is the time for you to take that paper and that pen out and take down some notes before you finally bid adieu to our lecture series. So once again, thank you so much everybody for joining me in this conversation, and I hope to see you all in our next lecture series.